It's a 3,000-year-old story, and I want to talk about the main characters: the shepherd boy, the king, the giant, and the 21st century author, Malcolm Gladwell. I'm not going to yell at you. I'm not going to drive off in a huff. I'm going to do my best to provide as many facts and as much logic as possible. Because we've all got questions. We just need to be a little better at thinking it through. Now, if you've never read it, I highly encourage you to check out the story of the rise, decline, and fall of King Saul found in 1 Samuel. But our story takes us to the Valley of Elah. This is where a battle is in preparation. It's the Israelites versus the Philistines. And one is on one side of a mountain, the other is on the other side of a mountain, both overlooking the Valley of Elah. Both sides are preparing for battle, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a cry comes out for single combat. If you don't know what single combat is, then think of the movie Troy.
Is there no one else?
I think that explains it pretty well. But let's look into what exactly was said regarding this demand for single combat. We find it in 1 Samuel 17, 8 through 10. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me, and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him, and kill him, then shall ye be our servants, and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together. For this single combat, the stakes really could not be higher. Winner take all. But who was it that cried out for single combat? We are told who it is in 1 Samuel 17, 4 through 7. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. First, let's go through the armory of Goliath. It says that he wore a coat of mail that weighed 5,000 shekels of brass. How much is that in terms that we understand? That's no less than 125 pounds. The weaver's beam is approximately 2 inches in diameter and about 10 feet tall. And then we have the head of the spear, which it said weighed about 600 shekels of iron, which in today's terms is about 15 pounds, no less. Can you imagine a spearhead going through you that weighed 15 pounds? Chances are you're not going to survive that thrust. But we have the boy, man, giant concept. We have this giant who is challenging men, including Saul, who is taller than everyone in Israel from the quote-unquote shoulders upwards, as is indicated in 1 Samuel 10. And then comes the boy. David arrives and asks, how is it that this Philistine is defying the armies of the living God? Saul hears about what David has said and then sends for him. Keep in mind, Saul would not send for David, nor would he have sent a boy to go challenge a giant with so much at stake if he didn't already know him, if he didn't believe him, if David hadn't already come highly recommended, and if he didn't believe that God was with him. But how can we know that Saul actually knew these things? Well, this is provided to us in 1 Samuel 16, 14, and 18. Verse 14 says, "But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him." In verse 18, it says, "Then answered one of the servants and said, Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, that is cunning in playing, and a mighty valiant man, and a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him." David had actually been before King Saul for quite some time, performing an incredibly vital role, which was to alleviate an evil spirit that was sent to Saul by God. And he did it by playing music. So we understand somewhat why Saul allowed David to go fight Goliath. But where did David's confidence come from? David actually lets us know in 1 Samuel 17, 33 through 37. "And Saul said to David, Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. David said moreover, The Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion, and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." So there is his confidence explained by David himself. But the question is, where exactly did he get the confidence to attack and fight a lion and a bear? Well, we actually find that out in 1 Samuel 16 and 13. "Then Samuel, who was the prophet, took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward." David had been anointed and destined to be king of Israel. So until that time took place to where he became king, anything was possible. David was, in a word, invincible. This is a 3,000-year-old story. But in 2013, Malcolm Gladwell, and let me go ahead and pause right here. I don't have a bone to pick with Malcolm Gladwell at all. I love his work, I love his books, I love his talks, and I love his podcast. But he wrote a book called David and Goliath: Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants. The book, and the TED Talk that was conducted a day before the book was released, did a great disservice to the biblical story. The TED Talk came out on September 30th, 2013, and as of right now on YouTube, has about 4 million views. Gladwell begins his talk much like I did, but soon he begins to question the true nature of Goliath as a champion warrior, and says that
we profoundly misunderstand Goliath. Goliath is not what he seems to be.
Gladwell states, the reason Goliath is a giant is because he suffers from acromegaly, which is caused by a benign tumor. This results in a hormonal disorder that develops when the pituitary gland produces too much growth hormone during adulthood. But what exactly does acromegaly do? Well, first, it causes poor vision, often double vision and nearsightedness. Gladwell makes his case based on what Goliath says to David in 1 Samuel 17:43, when he says, "Am I a dog that thou comest to me with sticks?" David has a staff in his hand. Gladwell suggests that Goliath actually sees 2 sticks instead of 1 when looking at David's staff. But that's a real stretch, because it's obvious that Goliath is indulging in sarcasm. But let's go on the assumption that Goliath is seeing double. Why wouldn't he know that he's seeing double. He wouldn't have just obtained double vision at the moment of this battle. He would have known that there were not two sticks. Another health issue that stems from acromegaly is that it causes cardiomyopathy, which results in shortness of breath, feeling tired, and leg swelling. It also causes ventricular arrhythmia, which causes an irregular heartbeat. Acromegaly typically happens to middle-aged people, but as Saul told David, Goliath had actually been fighting since his youth. This further indicates that everyone knew who Goliath was and had actually known about him for some time. It also indicates that Goliath was not just a giant during his adulthood, but also during his childhood. If we are asked to go on the assumption that Goliath being a giant is merely the result of a malfunctioning pituitary gland, then we should also consider, based on what Saul tells us, that he had this ailment as a child. Interestingly, this irregularity in the pituitary gland can happen to children. It's called gigantism. And here are some of the symptoms of gigantism: double vision, or difficulty with peripheral vision, joint pain, and weakness. So we are asked to believe that this champion warrior suffers from bad vision, cardiomyopathy, joint pain, weakness, leg swelling, shortness of breath, and ventricular arrhythmia. All of this would not make you a champion warrior. In fact, it would make you a terrible warrior. How could you be a great warrior if your vision was so bad? Now, Gladwell suggests that Goliath was only trained in close quarter combat. Even if you were only involved in close quarter combat, you are constantly tired, you have shortness of breath, and your legs are swelling. Now, unless you're fighting all of your battles from a perpetual warm bath of Epsom salt, then you're probably not the great warrior of your army. Also, if you suffer from ventricular arrhythmia, then war would not be your profession. Why? Because your heart would not be able to handle the massive adrenaline rush. There was another reach on the basis of bad vision. Gladwell states that an attendant led Goliath by the hand down the mountain. Goliath, led by the hand? This great champion warrior? I don't think so. Also, no version of the Bible, and I do think that there are way too many versions of the Bible, but let's move on. No version says that he was led by the hand into the valley. This attendant, as Gladwell references him, was actually very common for kings and great warriors. They were called armor bearers. Their job? Precisely what was stated in verse 7, to carry the shield. Now, we know two men who are directly related to this story who actually had armor bearers: King Saul and King Saul's son, Jonathan. During the talk, Gladwell also brings Goliath's height into question. He states that he's 6'9". Now, if Saul is taller than everyone from the shoulders upwards, then how tall was everyone else? Less than 6 foot? 5.5 feet tall? 5 foot tall? The scripture states that Goliath was 6 cubits and a span. That's 6.5 cubits, which is 9 foot 9 inches. And keep in mind, there were giants in those days. In fact, Goliath had 4 sons who were giants as well, and that is referenced in 2 Samuel 21. And giants are often mentioned in the Bible from Genesis up to this story and far after. You don't believe in giants? There's actually a lot of evidence out there for them. In fact, I have a link in the description from the National Institute of Health discussing this very subject. I encourage you to check it out whenever you get some free time. Now, late into the 20th century, a lot of these discoveries have been suppressed. And now that we're in the 21st century, I guess that really shouldn't come as too much of a shock. Also, 9 foot 9 inches is not improbable. In fact, at the turn of the 20th century, there was a Russian giant by the name of Fyodor Makhnov who was 9 foot 3. Now, I know for certain that Gladwell misspoke on at least one occasion during his talk when he stated,
If you do the calculations on the stopping power of the rock fired from David's sling, it's roughly equal to the stopping power of a 45 millimeter handgun.
a handgun that is also an anti-tank gun. A bullet from a 45 millimeter handgun would be about 2 inches in diameter. Can you imagine the recoil on that? If David's slingshot actually had the stopping power of a 45 millimeter anti-tank handgun, he wouldn't have had to go over and cut off Goliath's head. Goliath's head would have exploded on impact. So since he got the handgun wrong in his talk, chances are he got the height wrong too. And if he got those 2 things wrong, then chances are he got a few more things wrong along the way. He misquotes David regarding the lion and the bear by stating that
He says, no, you don't understand. I have been defending my flock against lions and wolves for years. I think I can do it.
he also categorizes David as just a shepherd, when in fact we know that even Saul's officials knew that David was not merely just a shepherd. In fact, he was a valiant man and a man of war. Gladwell states that while researching his book,
Everything I thought I knew about that story turned out to be wrong.
unfortunately, it seems that he now knows less than what he knew before he started research. Now, I encourage you to go to YouTube and watch the TED Talk, and then check out some of the comments in the comments section. You'll find that a lot of people feel pretty much the way that I do about it. One of my favorite comments that I ran across was by JLR Inc. when he says, in his next video, he tells how Samson didn't really kill a lion, he just kicked an arthritic cat. Gladwell's version of the story continues to be perpetuated, like on this Inc. article, where the author obviously takes everything secondhand from Malcolm Gladwell instead of firsthand from the scriptures. The TED Talk is called The Unheard Story of David and Goliath. Well, there's probably a reason why it's never been heard. This completely discounts the miracle by turning Goliath into a stumbling, weak, nearly blind giant who also has a heart condition. The fact is, Gladwell ignores major parts of the biblical passage in order to tell a story with the narrative that suggests, with or without God, you don't need to be afraid of your giants. Ultimately, it is saying we don't need God because giants aren't that scary. But it is the opposite that is true. Giants are scary. They are ruthless. And they wish nothing more than to, as Goliath stated, to feed our flesh to the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field. With God, all things are possible. And yes, there are people who are successful without God, but that success comes at a cost. And it's the cost of creating your own giant, which in turn crushes you. The story of David and Goliath is this. We are God's children, and we have been given a promise that we are overcomers, that we can face our giants without fear, just like David did with the lion, the bear, and the giant. David had a promise from God, and that was all he needed, and that's all we need. It is most unfortunate that Gladwell leaves God, the source of the victory, completely out of the equation. Without God, Saul would never have had the confidence in David, and David would have never had the confidence in himself. I'm Dustin Bass, and I've been thinking it through.